right, everyone, welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at the Federalist. We're coming to you today from Washington, D.C., where our guest is Senator Marsha Blackburn, also the author of the great new book, I just finished it last night, The Mind of a Conservative Woman, Seeking the Best for Family and Country. Senator Blackburn, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Oh, thank you for having me join you this morning. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we're fresh off the RNC as we're sitting here on Friday morning. I wanted to ask, first of all, what you thought of the president's speech and what you thought of the violence as senators like your colleague Rand Paul and other attendees of the speech at the White House were leaving the event.
Yes, what I understand was that as soon as people exited from the White House grounds, that there were protesters. And of course, these are anarchists, they're revolutionaries. I think it's fair to say they have really overtaken much of the Democratic Party's agenda. Bernie takes credit for the movement, as he called it. Their agenda, which was considered radical, is now the Democrat agenda. Socialized medicine, not calling out the rioters and looters, the Green New Deal, opening the borders. And people are really tired of this anarchy that is in the streets, and they want safe and secure communities. They want their children to be safe. On the president's speech, I thought he did a very good job last night. Solid, to the point. This is what we have accomplished. This is what we're going to do in a second term. That is what people want to hear. They want to hear that agenda. What are you going to do for them? And the Democratic Party missed the mark. They didn't lay out an agenda other than letting Bernie say the movement's agenda was now the Democrat Party agenda. I think another thing that the Democrat Party missed out on was talking about cancel culture. Mm-hmm. And they never took the time to say a respectful, robust political debate serves our nation well. And they seem to miss that. They never took the time to stand there and say thank you to our law enforcement and first responders. They didn't call for stopping this movement to defund the police. They didn't call for stopping this push to underfund the military. They didn't call for a stop to this language about abolishing ICE. And they should have done that.
I am so glad you mentioned the point about cancel culture. I had the same thought last night, and I found your book to be a really interesting read against the backdrop of the Republican National Convention, because your book really does, you rely on your personal experiences to kind of lay out your personal agenda and what it is to be a conservative woman. And I thought it was fascinating because this, in my opinion, was the convention where the Republican Party finally came out and said that they understand the culture war and they understand that they need to have these issues be priorities. And there's a quote in your book that I pulled out where you said, quote, "This isn't a bra-burning, man-hating, children-resenting, bitter-edged approach to life and politics. No. Good women love life, love their men, and are lovingly devoted to their children. They also love their bras. What they want is the freedom to be made the magnificent creatures they are made to be." And there's this, I think, tone throughout your book, and I saw it at the convention finally this week, where Abby Johnson gave that very moving speech about, quote, the smell of abortion. Do you think under President Trump, the GOP has finally sort of been shocked into realizing they need to prioritize the culture war? You spoke about cancel culture yourself.
Absolutely. And one of the things, I think this is the time for conservative women to step up and take their place in leadership, because we have seen this culture war grow and grow, and conservative women have been pushed aside and have been treated like fourth-class citizens by the mainstream press. And why is it? If you're pro-life, you're pro-family, if you're pro-business, pro-military, they shun you. They will shun you. And they will glorify and glamorize liberal women. And I have to tell you, Emily, a couple of weeks ago, when some of these leftist female organization sent a letter over to every newsroom in the country, how to talk about liberal women candidates and the VP candidate. I replied to them and I said, you should treat all women equally, and you shouldn't bash them for their beliefs. And I sent it to every signature on that letter as well as every newsroom. Here's the thing. When you talk to women, they will tell you they're not Democrat or Republican. Few women say they are partisan. But what will they tell you? They look at the issues. They make up their mind about where they are on the issues. And right now, they can't even have a discussion with some people. They have to keep themselves quiet. So my book is a great way to arm people up so that you understand the history of conservatism. And I go back into the 5 cities premise with Jerusalem and Athens. I talk about how federalism comes from the 12 tribes. We talk about London and Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. And we go back into the writings of de Tocqueville and Burke and Buckley and Kirk. This is who we are, and it brings us to modern conservatism. And most of these independent women I mentioned, they want rule of law. They want respect for the rule of law. They want fairness. All conservative principles.
Right, and all principles I think the RNC was very clear to put front and center at the convention this week. Yes, so.
And I really appreciated that our convention was full of diversity, and you had people, real people, who were talking about whether they were a small business person or whether they were a logger. They were talking about how they had prospered during the Trump administration. Important message to get out there.
You're an interesting figure, I think, on the right now, because the book talks about, you mentioned Road to Serfdom. You said it was like the Magna Carta of conservative economics to me. You talk a lot about Friedman, and as you just mentioned, all of those great writers, which is fantastic. And I hope that young conservatives take your advice and read those books. I wonder, as the Republican Party starts to muse over some of these proposals to address the Chinese Communist Party, to decouple our supply chain from China, and to talk about things like Section 230 reform and to rein in big tech, do you worry at all that there's a strain of anti-market conservatism creeping into the Republican Party, or do you think so far all of the proposals have fallen under the a reasonable umbrella of market principles?
Emily, I think that the term I use is not decoupling from China. I say we need to unravel some of these relationships. And pharmaceutical supply chain is one of those. And we've got to bring some of that manufacturing back stateside. So we're not going to totally separate ourselves, but what we're going to do is go to a realistic footing where we know that any business in China is the Chinese Communist Party. We need to admit that, realize that. And then what we need to do is be able to say, when it comes to our pharmaceuticals, our semiconductor chips, our supply chain for our U.S. military, telecommunications equipment, we need to make certain those critical infrastructure supply chains are stateside. I think it is just learning a lesson and being wise. When it comes to Section 230, of course, I've led the task force at Senate Judiciary, and I have worked on this issue for years when I was in the House. With Section 230, you don't want to toss it away, because when you do that, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to say. And you need to have protections for innovators and new start companies. The problem has become that your big tech is hiding behind Section 230 and using that as a shield to censor conservatives. And I have friends that are in the conservative entertainment and music industry. They get censored on social media all the time. but then you can hear some of the filth that comes from other entertainment genres. They never get censored. So as we begin to move into an era where we're using not only social media, but we're using a lot of AI, we need to realize that this is the time we have to lay down some of the principles on how we're going to utilize Section 230 and those protections, and who is going to be operating without those protections. It's also the time we have to go in and address the issues of privacy because of what is happening in telehealth and AI. HIPAA is going to need to be reformed. And these are things that, with the way our economic systems have developed, the way there is shared interoperability, the way you have data transfer and some of these data flows, that we're going to want some of those relationships with the UK, the EU. We're going to be very cautious when it comes to companies that are in China.
Interesting. There are some proposals on the table, and there's agreement, oddly, between the left and the right on some of the stuff. Do you support, or do you worry even that the support for breaking up some of these tech companies is anti-conservative, or do you think that they have actually grown to the part where part of, kind of tending to our capitalist garden would involve weeding out these monopolies?
One of the things that we know is that they are no longer infant businesses, and they are big businesses. Therefore, they should be up for review when it comes to issues of antitrust, which I think is what you are
Yes.
leading to. And it is appropriate that we do that, and we look at how they are going to not prohibit future competition, and we don't want them to block that innovation. You would never have had the iPhone. You would never have had apps. So we need to be realistic about this.
Speaking of the iPhone, this is a question I try to ask a lot of politicians and public figures in general. I wonder what you hear from your constituents. I think there's a growing concern, especially among parents of teenagers, about this tech in general, that it's, the censorship is one thing and the antitrust issues are another, but what they're actually doing to children, how they're shaping people's minds, how they're allowing easy access to pornography and bullying. Do you hear a lot about those issues from your constituents?
You know what I hear? And actually, this is one of the reasons for going in to my book and writing through what conservatism is and to talk about this, because I hear from women every single day. How do you talk to your kids and grandkids about this? I have heard from so many mothers who say, oh my goodness, my child went to college and she came home just very leftist. And I'm thinking, this is a child that has grown up in a conservative school, a conservative home, a conservative church. How did she move so far left? And I actually, in the book, go through how to talk about some of these issues in a thoughtful way so you can have a discussion with friends and family who tilt left, and to keep the doors open, not to shut doors, but to build bridges, and to remember that robust, respectful political debate is one of the reasons that our country has endured for 244 years. It is why we come together in the public square. We talk out issues. We decide to arrive at consensus. It's imperative to making laws. And as you all know, many times it is bipartisan participation in a law that makes it stay on the books and will not get challenged.
So this is great because a really, really interesting quote from this book I have right here. You say it also reminds us that rapid social change is destabilizing, particularly when that change is engineered by the untethered, unhinged, and unimaginative global left. And even thinking about tech, I have to imagine that's part of the cocktail that is accelerating this rapid social change that you mentioned. What are some of the other factors involved in that?
Yeah, now I want you to think about this in light of this. And of course, I wrote this book in 2019 and early 2020. I went to press back in March. But think of what has happened in the last 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
We have gone from having peaceful protests to having revolutionaries and anarchists that are running through our streets, earpieces in their ears, backpacks full of things to use to cause unrest. And it is like with Rand Paul last night. It was a person, then 30, then 60, then over 100. This is what we're seeing. My family this week, we have endured threats. We have endured death threats. I was in a restaurant one night, and all of a sudden, you have people banging on the windows of this restaurant, completely disrupting everybody in the restaurant because I was there. Now, this is what we have devolved to. And this is what is so unsettling to especially women who want their community safe. They want justice, they want equality, they want fairness. But they do not want anarchy and revolution running in their streets. And people are beginning to say, we have to get a handle on this. And as I say to people all the time, anybody who wants to have a conversation about how to make the lives of Tennesseans better, wonderful. I am willing to have that conversation. And these rapid social changes do not last, just as many times partisan divisive legislation that becomes law gets challenged and does not last.
Right. Right. And I'm thinking about this quote, and I'm thinking about you mentioned the book went to press in March, which makes sense because you respond to the Miss Americana documentary that was released in January. And part of, I think, what you're talking about is rapid social change is happening because these conversations can't happen anymore. And the left is basically just trying to steamroll the culture. And someone who probably would not have a conversation with you, even though you offer in the book to have a conversation with her, is Taylor Swift. How surprised were you when Taylor posted that Instagram during your election against your opponent? And basically, the post was all about you. I mean, it sounded like Democratic talking points straight from the DNC and called you a horrible person, basically. How surprised were you by that? You're someone who has a working relationship with the music industry.
I've had a very good working relationship with the music industry and have been one of the most fierce defenders of intellectual property rights and view this as a constitutional right. Your Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 provisions that are there in the rights reserved to our nation's creators. And things like that come as a surprise, but you do expect some of those surprises when you are in the process of running for office. And bear in mind, Tennessee had never elected a female to the U.S. Senate. We still, in our state, never had a female governor. So it was interesting to me to hear these talking points. And of course, I say in the book, I've got a whole chapter about the Stepford wives of liberalism.
Right away.
It's the exact same words with the same inflection. And of course, you could read the post that she put up and you knew that it was part of their talking points against me. So I go into explaining the vote, what I voted for, what I voted against, and a little bit about how laws are made. and how you can be for something, but then, Emily, you've seen it dozens of times. All of a sudden, a bill becomes not about an issue, it becomes a behemoth. And you've got all these things that get added onto the bill, and it doesn't even resemble what it started out to be. And the provision you had worked to get inserted ends up on the edit room floor. And so we go through a little bit of that exercise. But I think keeping doors open and building bridges instead of burning bridges is vitally important. And it's one of the reasons it is heartbreaking to me to see the anarchy in the streets and to see mayors that do not stand up and defend their citizens and defend these small business owners who are losing lives and livelihoods.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I grew up not very far from Kenosha. It's heartbreaking to see what's happening in Wisconsin right now. I wonder, is it just Taylor Swift, or have you noticed as the left's increasing intolerance for anybody who dissents from basically full-blown progressivism, have you noticed that it's other artists, maybe who you would have expected to have a good working relationship in the past, are more reluctant to work with you? Is your relationship with the music industry more troubled as the left is less willing to speak to people, or is it just sort of isolated cases here and there, like Taylor Swift?
It's kind of the isolated cases that are there. I have people that are good friends who are still good friends. I was talking last week, working on some issues with some of our songwriters and entertainers, and we're going to continue to work with them. Right now, I've been doing a lot of work trying to help get them through this COVID situation that we have. I was very pleased. Senator Rubio, who chairs small business, had worked with me, and we got the definition of small business changed to include sole proprietor, independent contractor, self-employed, which was vitally important to those in the music and creative industries. And there is a piece of legislation now that Senator Young is leading. It's called the Restart Act. This would be helpful. So we're putting a good bit of attention on that also.
Interesting. And in the book, you have a section, a pretty long section actually, on the French Revolution. And I think that section is long because it's your build up to talking about Burke. And you really come out as a full Burkean, which is fantastic. And I wonder, did you see there was a guillotine outside the White House last night? How eerie is that? Yeah, and they put a replica of President Trump under it.
Oh, I did not see that, but I am one of those. I believe you need to understand history. And I do believe it is important to look at the French Revolution and to look at Burke and kind of get inside his head, if you will, and look at his thoughts on conservatism and where that has led us. I had somebody this past week, I had recommended to them years ago that they read Atlas Shrugged. And they said they begrudgingly had embarked on reading Atlas Shrugged. And but understanding Ayn Rand and Hayek and where these individuals that were so powerful during their day and laying out the case for free markets and for individual abilities to exercise within those markets, and the case for individual ownership and property rights, why that is so vital to our way of life and to prosperity in our country. And it's why I put a reading list in my book. I think it's important to go back and look at every bit of this, and I think it strengthens our resolve for understanding what is conservatism and how did we get here. And then especially as you look at a time when society is so divided, isn't it nice to know what your founding and your underpinning is and to be able to articulate that? So I'm really hopeful that people are going to stay in touch with us on the book. And follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Parler, at Marsha Says, MARSHASAYS. And we're going to be continuing this conversation because educating ourselves and staying engaged as a happy warrior is how we take some of these mundane instances and make it a magnificent outcome, not only for us individually, but for our communities and our country.
You know, you talk in the book about how 4-H changed your life. And I wonder if, looking at your state and looking around the country, if this if this society that is, founded on these principles and founded on free market principles can exist without our civic institutions. Are you concerned about decaying civic institutions, especially in lower income, poorer, rural areas? Is that something you see, and what can we do about it?
Yes, I fully believe in these programs that encourage youth, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H Club, FFA, because it gives young people a way to learn how to lead. It gives them the ability to learn their strengths. It teaches them about proper competition. And if you work hard, you get rewards. Those are great foundational lessons. And of course, through 4-H Club, I learned about record keeping. I learned about competing and taking whether it was my canning or the apron I made, taking it to the fair and having it judged and accepting that outcome and realizing not everybody gets a ribbon and not everybody wins all the time. But you're in there competing. And that was a big part of our life and our experience in growing up. Public speaking, learning how to be a public speaker, participating in citizenship. My first trip to DC came through my 4-H Club experience.
And you also have a great story about your first trip to New York. And I won't spoil that. People should read the book. Fantastic. Another really great tidbit from the book is apparently you live in Minnie Pearl's house.
Yes, that's right. I do. And they're right outside of Nashville. And I say she gave me great political advice once upon a time after we had purchased the house. And I just love the house. It has a wonderful feel and spirit to it. And she said, honey, just open the doors, welcome people, love people, and they will love you back.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Wonderful.
Fantastic.
What a great lesson to all of us to be loving and caring and to portray that in our actions, to be welcoming to people and to be inclusive, not divisive in our comments and in our approaches.
Two final questions quickly. Yes. I don't want to take up too much of your time. The first one is just, as we're sort of dealing with the economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic, you mentioned how some of these bills sort of snowball into behemoths. I wonder if that's something that you believe happened with the first relief bill, and I wonder how you think we can tackle the fiscal situation we're in without adding to the national debt, which is frankly skyrocketing under this administration.
It really has skyrocketed, and that is just such a disappointment when you look at what has happened with COVID. And one of the things that some of us who are conservatives in the Senate are working diligently on, there's still $1 trillion out of the CARES Act that has not been spent. So all of this talk from Nancy Pelosi about how we need another $2.65 trillion. Why don't we spend the money that's already appropriated? Why don't we reprogram those dollars, reposition those dollars? We should challenge, the president should challenge every cabinet secretary to get inside of their budgets and see where there are pockets of money that can be used to reposition for testing, for vaccine research and development, for optimized antibodies. And let's see what we can do with those dollars first. How can we get some of those dollars into PPP loans? How can we get that money to small businesses? That is what we ought to be doing right now, is using what is already on the table rather than saying, oh, let's just go print up another $2.65 trillion and spend it willy-nilly. And that's exactly what the Democrats are wanting to do. Print up more money, give them the ability to spend it, and they'll tell us later how they've done that.
I think they genuinely believe that we can print as much money as we want to, and it's like modern monetary theory, and it'll just be okay. It'll all be fine. We can run our own little microeconomy here.
What's so interesting to me about this, I have 2 grandsons, and I have a granddaughter that's going to be born this week. And as she is born, she is going to have about $70,000 of U.S. debt that she's responsible for. Now, think about that. Our children and our grandchildren cannot afford to run these printing presses with no thought to how this is going to be paid back. It's a moral issue.
Right. And that brings me to my final question, which is, if President Trump gets a second term, obviously it depends on what the House and the Senate look like, but don't we have to tackle entitlement reform to address the national debt, period? And do you have conversations with President Trump about the debt? What do you think we can expect in terms of a Republican administration going forward dealing with this?
One of the things we are going to have to be diligent about doing is looking at both the mandatory spending side of the ledger and then look at the appropriated side, the side that we come in on that discretionary side, and that is where you see a lot of our work, but beginning to do more in a more efficient way and utilizing technology and right-sizing government. That should be our goal. How do we meet the needs that need to be met and get money where it needs to be, do it in a more efficient manner that is going to be fair for today's taxpayer and tomorrow's wage earner and taxpayer, and use technology to streamline these systems. We are overdue. Businesses have been doing that for the last decade. The federal government needs to do it also.
Senator Blackburn, thank you so much for your time this morning.
I've enjoyed being with you. Thank you.